Hello, everyone, and welcome to Gaming Mechanics, a podcast seeking to explore the unexplored topics of games, how they work, and why we love them. With me is Greg.
Hello.
And today we are doing a show about the future of horror. For those of you who did not catch it, we went ahead and streamed a sampling of 4 different indie horror games, and while there were egregious technical difficulties, we did in fact play some really interesting games, and the streams are probably not the greatest thing to go check out, but you certainly can listen to us talk about our experience.
And indie would be a generous term, actually, for some of these games. I think a couple of them, at least, were grad school projects.
Yeah, that's fair.
Bordering more on proof of concept than anything else. So yeah, they were all free, and none of them were very long at all. Except for, I guess, Nightmare Ned that was put out by a professional studio, but it was also from like 1997, I think. So
yeah, I think so.
But yeah, so I guess this week it's been 5 weeks when we said we were just gonna let's do some spooky stuff in October. We didn't really think through the fact that we're gonna have to do that, one, for an entire month, but two, that it would constitute 5 episodes, which at this point I believe is at least a fourth of our entire catalog. Yeah, this is episode 20.
That's right. Yeah, this is episode 20.
So it's kind of ironic that we are 1/4 a horror game podcast. But,
people will be so confused if they look back over our episodes.
What? Greg's mouth was hurting at one point, and then you just did death and expectation. Anyway, so we are ending our spookiness, and I'm kind of okay with that. I watched Silence of the Lambs 2 nights ago, and then I started Stranger Things, and I watched the 1990s miniseries It. Finally.
Oh.
And then we played some spooky stuff on Saturday. So it's probably been more scary stuff this month than my entire life.
Yeah, no, same. I don't usually go this hard on Halloween, but like this month I feel like I have just gone ham on celebrating Halloween. Like maybe more than any other holiday of my entire life.
It puts my childhood Christmases to shame. In terms of
pretty
the amount
much.
of time I've invested in a holiday this month is obscene. So
I did watch. You're all going to throw rocks at me, but this is for the very first time that I watched The Nightmare Before Christmas was yesterday.
Oh, really?
I had never seen it.
Well, if they're throwing rocks at you, man, I'm getting switchblades or something because I've never seen that.
Oh man, well it was quite good.
Yeah.
It was. It really wasn't a horror. It's not really a horror movie. I know this isn't a podcast about movies, but it does go back to what we were saying before about how like a horror aesthetic does not make a movie or a game a horror movie. Like there's a lot of really weird and creepy stuff, but it wasn't trying to like get you unnerved.
To pulse you and get your pulse up and yada yada yada.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, totally. So this week, like I said, we're going to go through one thing that kind of came out with these indie games, which was cool, is because they were so experimental, was that they actually kind of made us think about potential future of horror, in terms of how some of these proofs of concept could be turned into something bigger, or just kind of new ideas, new things new systems, new ideas that we hadn't really thought of, and just a little bit outside of what mainstream horror games were. And so we're gonna use those 4 games that we played, which we'll go over in a second, as examples, and then we will end with the only actually creepy thing that we've done on the podcast, kind of. But we wanted to do like something actually creepy-ish
on the podcast. Yeah,
right, exactly. Yeah, we streamed some horror games, but wanted to like actually have something for the listeners. So we're going to read one of the classic creepypastas. Called Candle Cove at the end, and hopefully creep you out a bit.
That's our goal, and if you do not wish to be spooked, then it won't be till the end, so you can listen to the rest of this.
It's not that. Man, I don't do like a month ago I would have probably been horribly spooked by this, but now I'm like I've eliminated all innocence, and I'm like, this is stupid.
Desensitization.
I think I might actually, yeah, right, dude. I mean, seriously, it's incredible. All right, so. Let's start off with just going through some of the systems that we saw that were cool, that we hadn't really seen before, / just a few of them that we're thinking of when we're thinking of future stuff. So in terms of innovation, I think we were thinking in terms of a few different categories in terms of um, limitations, visual limitations in games. So we have like Outlast, right? That is dark and then allows you to see through night vision, and that was like kind of a big deal. And then one of the games we
Mhm.
played on stream was called Shutter, in which the lights go out and you only have a camera, and you can the only source of illumination for the camera is flashing the light. Um, and so that idea, kind of going forward, the idea of storytelling being a primary horror device, kind of in an Until Dawn way that we've talked about. Uh, Obviously, whenever people talk about the future of games, think about VR.
Mhm.
And good lord, what they could do with that. Part of me doesn't even want to think about
Yeah.
it. But you pointed out bodily horror could definitely be a part of that, where you look down and see your own body be changed.
Well, the reason I thought of it was a body horror specifically with in relationship to VR was I was watching a trailer for a game called Until Dawn Blood Rush, I think is what it's called. And yeah, Rush of Blood, Until Dawn
Oh.
Rush of Blood, which is related to Until Dawn nominally, apparently. Like after watching the trailer, I don't really know its
Yeah, you were
connection to
describing
Until
to me,
Dawn.
and I was like, I hear absolutely zero
It's
coherence between
enough.
those two
I don't
things.
really, unless there's some like characters that carry over between the games. Again, just in name only. But
Right.
there was a scene where they showed a doctor coming over to inject you with some fluid, and I was just thinking how much creepier that would be in VR.
Yeah,
Like,
man. Where someone.
it's like, yeah, you almost are like preparing. I felt myself imagining if that was my only field of vision, like actually tensing to be injected. Like,
Oh, absolutely. Your body would respond to
and
that for sure.
exactly. And so like I think there's a much better opportunity for you to actually feel like, oh, I'm about to be injected than when you're watching a screen.
Yeah, and I
More
mean that.
chances to interact with the person's perception of their own body.
Yeah, so that's like I think that's when you're starting to get to those points. We talked about this a decent amount in terms of the way that horror games take advantage of natural neurological processes to scare you, kind of kicking you into that adrenaline place, kind of dampening a lot of your higher brain functioning. I think when you begin getting to the point, like no one's concerned about that, generally not ethically or even safety wise. People get scared all the time, and that's fine. But I think when you start to get into the point where you're like directly influencing, like if you're actually going to begin reaching a high level of realism to the point where your body is assuming that it's actually being damaged, like you're really directly getting into some of those neural pathways and tricking them. That's the sort, and I think we mentioned this once or twice, but that's the sort of place where I could legitimately see people. You could actually probably very much actually traumatize someone that way.
Yeah.
Getting into shock, certainly any PTSD sort of thing could be very easily triggered that way. Any level of cardiac unhealth could potentially, people have been saying that it's probably only a matter of time till someone actually is scared to death by VR. So
Right.
yeah, the idea that you could actually very very well, in all ways minus the actual sensation, begin like actually simulating like getting murdered or tortured, um,
hmm
would I think that would be, I mean, one, I would have absolutely no interest in that, but two, there's actually like very serious consequences to doing something like that, right? That would be scarring, I would imagine. So yeah, VR is scary as shit.
Yeah, and like think of like the VR experience from the perspective of like your limbic system. Like, what is there to tell your brain that it's not actually happening? Like,
I
it's
mean,
all you
almost
can
nothing.
see, it's all you can hear. Like, what would be the difference between somebody actually walking up and injecting you with something and seeing that in a VR headset? The only difference is the the
Sensation.
sort of meta part of your brain, the frontal cortex, knows this isn't actually happening. This is a simulation.
Yeah, but
But
that gets
like,
dampened during fear anyway, so it's harder
exactly.
to actually be able to do that.
So like, it's pretty much not any different.
Well, just think about like the experience, like yeah, say like any horror game. We talked about this with death, right? Where you die and there's these really gruesome killing scenes. I've never once felt, I've never been tapped into the fear of actually dying when I've done that. If I was in VR and it showed me getting murdered, someone like grabbed me and like stabbed me, and then I'd like watch that happen, I would imagine that would, like, yeah, you said there's the pain sensation, but basically every other system in your body's been trained to believe that that's happening, and you very well might experience something very close to what you would feel being actually attacked, and that has very deep consequences on people who have to live through that. So, all that is to say, VR.
We spent so much time wondering if we could. We didn't think about if we should.
Jeff Goldblum has been the prophet of our times. So yeah, that's to say, I'm sure there will be some great VR horror experiences.
Oh yeah.
And we're definitely painting the most ugly picture possible, but that tends to be where people go with horror. So, yeah, that seems like a very, very real possibility. What else we got here? Oh yeah, we'll get to this in a sec. I think we'll just talk about this lurking, but sound and / biofeedback in games is a really cool and exciting one. I think it'll be a little bit harder to do just because it'd be very, very hard to bundle biofeedback hardware with. You need hardware for that, right?
Right.
And
well, the thing is, like, biofeedback,
like
I think, goes really well with VR, actually, because you already have got so much gear on the person's head, like to add a mic or to add EKG sensors on the top of, anyway, the head sensors,
ECG.
electrical, ECG, sorry, on your scalp wouldn't be that much more invasive than already wearing this helmet. And so if people are willing to wear a helmet, like you can get a lot of metrics from them just from that. And so I think that VR could end up using a lot more of those sorts of things in relatively near future.
Yeah, totally. So I think, yeah, that would be the huge. I sincerely doubt that'll ever be mainstream, just because of the hardware limitations on that. It's not something that everyone, like, when you make an innovation on software, everyone can get it, right? Because they all have a computer,
right.
Particularly on PC, and then even versus. I mean, you think about, like, the Kinect getting bundled with the Xbox One and how big a deal that was, having everyone having video, and that kind of even fizzled out, and the Kinect isn't being made anymore. So I would imagine that the biofeedback stuff won't catch on, would be my guess, unless it just becomes a really, like, it's also really specific things, right? To, like, measure your heart rate, you need, like, some sort of pulse monitor / certainly an EKG, ECG would be the the most intense version of that. But, like,
right.
you don't have, like, one thing that monitors all your different bio. Like, you can't just bundle one device. Like, you need multiple ones if you want to do, like, the amount of cortisol in your sweat, or like the body, like your skin electrical sensitivity, that sort of thing that you could actually. Right. That being said, there are some really cool little sample games that have used some of those stuff and some of those things, and lurking was one of them. So sound would definitely be one that they could do, and we'll get there. I think lurking was actually the most promising game we played of the four.
Certainly, like, conceptually.
Yeah,
the concept that they used in lurking was fairly generalizable in a cool way.
Could very much be built on.
Another type of innovative horror we encountered was just a sort of surreal, bizarre horror, and there are so many, like, there seems to be a trend right now in horror where games really want to justify the premise to be grounded in reality. There's so much talk of, like, psychiatric hospitals and insanity and the losing grip on reality and all sorts, maybe drugs, maybe hallucinations, who knows what, but, like,
program,
right, it's all tricks of the mind.
For all these things happening. Right.
Exactly. But the thing is, in a horror game, you don't actually need to do that. Like, I'm not actually quite sure why all these games want to be so grounded in reality. Maybe it's the psych horror piece that we were talking about that makes it a little bit which necessitates the groundedness. But, like, so one of the games we played, and I think we can just jump right into talking about 1916 because we covered everything else. One of the games we played was 1916: The Forgotten War. And Greg, you want to describe the premise of that game?
Yes, this is one of my favorite things to do. I got to do this to Mark and Xander, and they had identical reactions. So the idea is it's a pretty cool project. It's first person. You are in the trenches in World War I, 1916, on the Eastern Front. Or wait, no. Yeah, I guess it would have been the Eastern Front, World War I. And everything's in grayscale, black and white. It's very, very gritty and a realistic art style. And you're a German soldier. and it's the idea is to kind of convey the stress and the intensity of being chased and never being able to rest in war, being shell shocked and having traumatic things happening around you and having to deal with it. And So the best pitch is actually literally it's World War One with velociraptors. So it's
There
you're in
it
the
is.
trenches. You're in a trench system. There's velociraptors chasing you, and that's literally the whole game. Your job is to find the ladder out of the trenches, and then it has this. I won't spoil the ending, I guess. But yeah, there's a couple puzzles and some items you can pick up. Really simple combat system, and yeah, there's some velociraptors in the trenches.
It's the Raptors in the trenches. And this game takes itself 100% seriously.
Yeah, they play it
Like,
straight. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and I think they kind of have to. Like again, we talked about that how humor can kind of unravel horror, and
Right.
they did a great job. And like it was surreal.
And it
They
worked.
were not trying to be realistic. They were not trying to justify it. They just handed you a premise and they asked you to experience it.
Yeah, yeah. And there was no like you are like this is actually an interesting topic more in terms of stories in general, but I was reading a really interesting article about the current kind of trend or need for like fully fleshed out three-dimensional characters in every single work of art and having every single character be a three-dimensional character when that's actually not one, I don't think that's necessary for good storytelling. But two, it might actually be sometimes counterproductive, where sometimes you'll need one or two dimensional characters. So, like in this case, we did not need to know, like we didn't need to know our soldier's backstory. We certainly didn't need to know if there was something potentially in his childhood that had upset him with velociraptors, and this is there's potential that he's going insane in an asylum, or he's having PTSD and injecting like certain fear toxin into him that's experiencing his worst memories along with his worst fear. Like none of that. Like
Yeah, there was no attempt
absolutely.
to ground it.
And it worked pretty darn well actually. The art style was the Velociraptors look creepy, and certainly they did a good job with the feeling of like stress and the art form or the art design was really bleak and then just the experience of being lost in a maze of tunnels. It made you kind of there's one map in the game that you can find the whole area of tunnels and you have to memorize basically from the map how to get out. You could just like write it down if you wanted, but we tried to not do that. And so it was surprisingly effective. I mean, you can take like 5 minutes if you know exactly what you're doing to beat it.
Right.
Um, but it was surprisingly I thought it was really cool.
Yeah, I know. I was actually pretty surprised when I heard the premise. I was like, "Is this even going to be scary? Like, is this just going to be like laughable?"
And I
And
didn't even
and
play
it
it,
wasn't.
right? Mark was the one that was streaming it, and I was watching, and I imagine it's even worse
Yeah,
for
there
you.
was. Well, there was the thing about having a short game, and we talked about this after the stream, is you can kind of pull out all the stops immediately. So, like,
Right.
you don't have to worry about the slow ramping, where you don't want to kind of scare the player too much in the beginning, or you don't want to give away certain types of scares in
Pulling
the
all your
beginning,
cards.
because you want to ration it in a game like as long as Outlast, which is long as far as horror games go. Like, a 5 or 6 hour horror game is actually quite long. This was like 10 minutes. So they could yeah have all sorts of explosions going off and raptors and crazy dancing corpses, which
Oh yeah,
is
I forgot
actually
about that. That
still
was actually the worst part
inexplicable.
of that.
We still don't know why that was there, but
Yeah.
again,
You
no,
want to
the
talk
game
about
did
that?
not explain itself.
Yeah, no, the game. This is a great example of the game not explaining itself. Was that guy dead before he started dancing?
It's really unclear.
Okay, he was just on the ground, and then he got up.
No, he wasn't on the ground. He was just
Oh, okay.
there on the
Yeah.
wall,
Yeah.
seemingly
Oh, that's
hanging.
right. That's right. And then yeah, and then he started doing this weird, bizarre dance.
Yeah, it was kind of like the hand jive, but
Yeah. It was mostly hand based, but that was freaking weird and
it was
deeply
very
unsettling
strange.
actually. So
One,
that was a great
one,
example of like that's what we were talking about, kind of in this like surrealism, bizarre horror where it's like it doesn't need to entirely justify or ground itself, but it was also highly effective at what it did, and it was different enough where like it wasn't. This happened. Almost all the other games we played were about psychiatric hospitals, and
yeah,
I was just like, holy, like it's just I'm sure just along with like the advent of the scientific age and growing awareness of mental health issues and that's a thing, that's a more modern horror take, right? The idea of going insane and secret governmental programs, stuff like that. That being said, it's I've been playing horror games for a month and I was already tired of it at the end as a setting. So it was actually refreshing to have a completely ungrounded World War I horror experience.
And it was still creepy. It was still scary.
Yep.
So
now, the last thing we'll say, you were mentioning this, Mark, was basically it's very possible that game couldn't have been much longer, right? That you would not have been to expand that into a full-length title. And so there may be some level of this bizarre surrealist kind of strategy isn't... there might be a reason we don't see more of that, which is it's really difficult to make that last over a long period of time. Which might be true. But regardless, I'd love to see more people try.
Yeah, I
maybe
would love
those
to
exist.
see that.
We just haven't, we've been doing this for a month, so I'm sure there's more things out there that do that.
Well, and just having a game where, again, you don't necessarily feel the need to ground everything that's happening.
Right.
Like, especially when you're dealing with horror, I feel like it's okay to just kind of have stuff happen and be unexplained and kind of jerky, because
it keeps you off balance as a viewer.
That's unsettling. Like, it's part of the medium is to, like, not know what's going on. And so, like, if you can put a bow on it at the end and explain why it was all happening, cool. But, I mean, at that point, the person's already had the experience.
Right.
Like,
that's
they've already been scared, and that was the goal in the first place. You don't actually need to know what's going on. In fact, sometimes it helps to not know if you're, in terms of, it makes it scarier to not know while it's happening.
Case in point being, like, a lot of J.J. Abrams stuff that he did earlier, which I think is brilliant. He was far more about getting a certain reaction from you as a viewer as opposed to justifying why it actually happened in the universe. So, like, Lost is one of my favorite shows of all time. And I still maintain season 1 of Lost, I think, is some of the best television ever produced. But they obviously got lost. Actually, I didn't mean to do that. They got the creators got pretty lost in the middle of the series in terms of they'd thrown out so many hooks that were these cool ideas and there were mysteries. They didn't have any answers for them, and that ultimately, and they eventually brought it back around, and I maintain they actually ended it pretty darn well. But all things considered, it was very similar in that a lot of things were far better when they were mysteries, or more unknown, or the very classic trope of what people fill in will usually be scarier than what you're told. So I think I totally agree with that. I think that goes for horror as a whole. Stuff like think about like the original, I don't know, like some of the classic slashers, right? With like Freddy Krueger, like you have no idea why why he exists, or Michael Myers in the original Halloween. Those all have like small amounts of backstories, usually something horrifying, but like no huge amount of like groundedness in it. They just ask you to buy into it, and it's scary. So.
Yeah, it's interesting that idea has sort of disappeared, or it hasn't disappeared. That's too strong, but it definitely is not as popular. Like, and that goes with the three-dimensional characters you were talking about. Where if every character is going to be three-dimensional, then like so does the villain, and like so does the person that you're playing as in the game. And it does sort of force the game to become more grounded, because if you're trying to give a deep a rational explanation for like this creepy crazy monster, well, you kind of end up with like the Scooby-Doo effect, where it's like, oh, it was the mayor the whole time.
Exactly.
And you can like ramp that up to make it creepier, like, no, the mayor like was dosed with some crazy chemical and was spent 2 years in a psychiatric hospital slowly going insane. But at the end of the day, like, it's still I feel like you take some.
Get played out.
Exactly.
That's been the answer to a lot of like, okay, so what? Why is this all creepy? It was an experiment.
There was an experiment going wrong.
And then people went crazy. So like I said, maybe we just hit a lot of that by accident, but I think that's probably pretty ubiquitous in the genre right now, across the board. So.
I mean, even the little bit of. Until Dawn, Rush of Blood, I watched had a person who was getting ready to inject you, and it said therapy starts October 13th was like what the end of the trailer said. It's just it's crazy, but it's in a lot of places.
Finished Arkham City, which was 2011, so that was 6 years ago now. But same thing, the main villain is a psychiatrist, and you are institutionalized at the very beginning, and it's supposed to be the depth of horror. I mean, the whole idea of Arkham Asylum as a whole, right? This hellhole of craziness and lunacy.
Well,
So
speaking of hellholes, let's go on to
yes, let's go
Shudder.
to Shudder.
Let's talk about Shudder. So I really
we had
didn't
an
like
we had a
playing
very
Shudder.
yeah, we had a very
Uh,
unfortunate experience of Shudder. I think
we did, and that is too bad. But let
not
me just talk
entirely
about
its
the
fault.
beginning first before we get to
Yeah,
the
please
part
do.
that kind of ruined a bit of the game for us. So in the beginning, you're just like you wake up. I think you wake up. I don't know. You're in bed
No,
and
you
you
wake
get up
up.
out of bed,
Yeah,
and you
go
just wander
outside.
around your house for a bit. It's totally normal house. Got some boxes set up. Looks like you're either moving out or moving in.
You're in an apartment.
Yeah, you're in an apartment. Pretty high up. You can tell from the window. And there's some creepy wall art and some interesting color choices. A lot of black, white, and red.
Yeah, red
But
is
other
kind of
than
the
that,
prominent color.
yeah, that's the only accent color that's used in the whole house. But other than that, it's a pretty normal house. And
Oh
I'm
yeah, no,
already
any
I
living
like
space.
that's like one of the reasons I didn't like it. I was like,
Yeah,
this is awful. Like,
that's the only one you play.
home invasion is a real thing that happens,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I don't want to play a game where I need to simulate this.
Dude, imagine VR like if you could somehow upload the floor plan of your home
Oh my gosh.
and then like they have like a tool where you get to build your house like The Sims and you just make your own house and then you get attacked in it.
Dude, this is the future of horror,
That's
people.
oh my god, that sounds like a horror. That's so horrible.
This is a terrible idea.
That is a
Literally
great
training
idea,
your
though.
brain that certain environments are dangerous that you have to
Yeah, see,
spend
that's the
every
thing
day
though.
in.
Like, yeah, that would have actual real world consequences. Like, you would
Yeah,
experience that, and then you would not be able to live in your home anymore. Like,
yeah, exactly.
so anyway, don't do that. But that's anyway. Shudder.
So yes, so what happens after you wander around for a while is you hear a phone buzzing, or maybe you don't, and you spend way too long wandering around. But you're
Yeah,
supposed to hear a phone
I wanted to
buzzing.
touch on that. Yeah.
Uh,
or you don't, and that's fine because you're not a stupid person, and the game wasn't well designed.
yeah, well, that is true. It didn't do a great job directing you to where you went. It did try to do some subtle things, but you find a phone after a
Right.
long enough time buzzing, and you look at it, and then eventually it stops buzzing because you can't pick it up for some reason, and then you're in a different version of your house, and
Lights
so
go out.
like, yeah, the lights go out. It's dark. You see this distant flashing happening, and your house has changed materially. Like
Yeah.
the doors are boarded up, some of the boxes are gone,
Yeah.
and there's a
Floor
hallway you
plan is
couldn't
pretty much the
access
same.
before.
But,
Yeah, the
yeah,
floor plan is
there's-
pretty much the same, but there are some
your house is
physical
actually
differences
changed.
to the house.
Right.
And so then you go over, you see what the flashing thing is, and it's your camera, and you pick up your camera, and you can use your camera to see one flash at a time. So you can see in this game only by flashing your camera.
One frame-ish.
Yeah,
It's probably
about,
like 3 or 4, but
yeah, it was probably a few frames, but I mean, it was not
quick.
long. It was quick. It did not feel like, oh,
Enough.
it did not feel like a flashlight. Like, it felt
Yeah.
very restrictive. And so then, and I would say that the house just sort of changing its structure is a cool example of them not trying to explain everything. Like, yeah, it's a horror game. Now your house is different. Deal with it.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I actually liked that a lot. That's something I'm surprised we hadn't run into as much, which was basically the game yanking the carpet out front, and like maybe like maybe we just didn't play enough. But I've played a decent amount of horror games now actually, and actually changing something in a way that like not just like the environment has changed, but like you are actually in a different place than you think you should be.
Right.
That was a cool thing. That was like
Something
the first
you
time I'd seen
thought
that
you
all
were
along.
familiar with all of a sudden, like, is
It's
changed.
fundamentally different. Yes. Yeah. Not just like spookier, but like it's you now can't go in this door and there's a new hallway. Like that's creepy.
And if you open the bathroom door, you will actually soil your pants.
Yeah.
So.
And then you. Yeah.
So then we
Brown
wandered
outfits.
with the camera down this very long, winding staircase, which was so many floors that I probably wouldn't have even gone all the way down had I not actually seen a playthrough of the Silent Hill playtest, in which you go down an
Oh, really?
obnoxious number of stairs. So I was
didn't-
like,
I
okay.
told you to give up on stream. I think.
Yeah, you
Go
did.
back
You
up.
did. You told me to turn around. But I didn't. I kept going. And so we go ostensibly to the bottom of the apartment complex and, in fact, into the basement.
Right.
And
That's where the fuse box is.
Yeah, it's where the fuse box was. Yeah, maybe it was to try to turn the lights back on. I guess I didn't really think about that. Maybe
Yeah, I think
I
that was
was
the idea.
supposed to
Was
be
that we
thinking
were.
that as the gamer, like, oh, I'll go to the basement to turn on the.
Yeah, yeah.
No way.
As
If I'm
yeah, as the
actually in that scenario, it's like, no, I wait for maintenance to turn on the lights. I'm not going to the
or yeah, I
basement of an
board myself
apartment
in my room,
complex.
or yeah, jump out of the window when that friggin' music started, or the
Yeah,
sound started, and my apartment changed. Like,
yeah, right.
I'll probably just go turn the lights on. It's probably just a balloon fuse. Nope, nope, nope. But we're like, you might
Probably
be in hell
not.
now.
So we
So
wandered into the basement and we encountered our very first monster. He's kind of this shadowy outline of a human. And we got a prompt that I missed the first time saying that I can use the right mouse button in order to zoom in with my camera, which I was supposed to do.
right,
And I did not do that. And so consequently, we are trapped in the room with this shadow monster with no way out. The door turns into a brick wall behind you. Like, you
yeah.
cannot leave. It is a sealed room. There's nowhere to go, and there's a shadow man. And
Yeah,
if
and it's
and
just a shadow man. It really is. It's a humanoid form of like kind of dark smoke, shadowy.
yeah,
And it's
and it
scary
was
in
like,
frame by
yeah,
frame. Like when you see that and you see the outline, you're like ah. But then
it was
you keep on
creepy at
doing that.
first, as creepy as it sounds like it would be. But yeah, after 20 seconds of like, well, he's
Well, and
not
he
doing
doesn't
anything
interact
to
with you
me.
at all. He didn't. We walked up to him and allowed him. We just kept on hitting the shutter to see if he kept on coming towards us, and he did. And then he gets all the way up to you, and nothing happens. So there was absolutely, unfortunately, I think because we had missed that instruction, which is really I don't know why, and like even in the game's terms, why zooming in on him would have made anything happen the way it did. But we managed to inadvertently pretty much ruin the monster of the game in the first like 10 minutes where we'd also been through a few hardware issues as well as like we got we couldn't find the phone at the very beginning. We just kind of went through the room like 15
Right,
times, so it was very very clear example of what we talked about in the very first episode this month, which was kind of the pacing and the expectation of a game that if fear isn't properly managed eventually becomes mundane and you completely undercut your monster.
right.
So similar as opposed to a game like Amnesia, right, where their monsters really aren't that scary, and there's only two of them, and they keep you scared for tens of hours. As opposed to this one, we ended up getting caught in a room with him. He did nothing to us. We understood the way he moved and worked, and suddenly it wasn't scary anymore. So we reloaded the game and tried again, and
We
did it
got
right
past
this
that
time,
part, which was good.
and then got into the next area, and in large part it was. I mean, at that point we were already kind of I wasn't playing it, but there's some level of feeling like okay, there's only so much farther. Like this is the most extreme version of Outlast, right? What I make the joke that like the next game will be like you have basically like a flint and like a piece
Right.
of like a match, and you can only strike sparks off and then illuminate like 3 feet in front of you. Um,
Yeah, in
so
terms of the
limiting
vision
vision can only
restricting.
go so far.
Yeah,
One
exactly.
idea we had, which all right, who did you say this or did I? I can't remember. Either way, someone we were talking about the idea of one thing they could have done, which yeah, that's right. Okay, you were talking about this, Mark. That there's almost no limit to how quickly you can flash
Yeah,
the camera, and if they had put in like I don't know, like 3 seconds, maybe 2 second interval, short. But still, like a lockout period, then that would have really made each flash more meaningful, as well as like you would have to make a choice when you were doing it. And then
yeah.
I
You
thought
could. I
that
think you could do it once a second, and I think
okay, second,
once every like 5 to seconds or 10 seconds would have been much better.
yeah. And then I was thinking like what would be even cooler would be the idea of like just instituting like actual dark vision, right? So as your eyes are exposed to less and less light, there's a protein that breaks down and allows you to see in dark light, lower vision or lower light, and that's just what happens. And then when you get exposed to more light, or other way around, actually, the proteins build up. Then you get exposed to light, those proteins break down, and you lose your dark vision, and you have to wait. So it'd be a cool idea that like if immediately after you flash, you can't see, or even like it kind of gives you a slight after image
Yeah, that would
of
be
what you
cool.
just saw. And then over time, maybe make it a little bit shorter than in real life, which is like 5 to 8 minutes. Have your dark vision come back, where it never gets great, right? But at least you can like navigate when it's all the way there. But then if you flash again, then it resets. That could be a cool another way to use the vision mechanic, other than just limiting it more.
Yeah,
So
I think that there is some potential for doing a different game with this. Um, but I wouldn't say that the concept is as generalizable and broad as the one from Lurking that we'll get to.
right, yeah.
Once we were in the basement, there definitely was some spooky parts to the point where Xander was
Oh yeah, we really messed
quite
him up.
off put at one point where we died,
Oh yeah, he had to
um,
leave.
and and
That
that
was weird,
was
actually. I don't quite get why you responded so strong. It was really scary. That was a so that we actually our comfortability with the shadow monster backfired when we had been comfortable with it, and then it appeared again later, and we were like, okay, we get this thing. And then one of the times we just flashed, and it wasn't a shadow anymore. It was this like horrifying human with like blades and spikes stuck through his body, and then
yeah,
it killed us.
we died.
Which was that was a good scare, man.
It was.
Again,
And
something I'm surprised didn't happen a little bit more, which was making you comfortable with something and then immediately pulling the rug out from under you.
yeah, I guess it's the second time the game did that, and I think to great effect too. I mean, they didn't know we were going to get so comfortable with the monster,
Right, yeah.
but it's still we had kind of been used to Mr. Shadow and Beware the Shadow, and then all of a sudden it wasn't a shadow.
Yeah, there's a bunch of writing on the wall too about like beware the shadow and like stay away from the shadow, and I was like, okay, this is like a small game, it's probably just the shadow monster, and that's like creepy. And then yeah, then it was suddenly a highly textured. This is probably the best looking game we played. Um,
Yeah,
and it was a well rendered thing,
human.
horrifying image.
Yeah.
Uh, and then it killed us. So that was scary. So then we stopped playing because we had more to do, and it was. I think we kind
Xander
of
was
got
in
the
the
idea
fetal
of what that game
position.
had to offer us. Yep. And
Yeah, we
Xander.
didn't want to start all over. Actually,
Oh, that's the other
1916 and
thing. Yeah.
Shudder both suffer from a lack of checkpointing, which
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and contend that in horror games, checkpointing is super important because
Yeah.
otherwise you force people to be re-exposed to the same scares that aren't scary
All the same
anymore.
reasons we've talked
So
about. Yep.
you allow people to just to take your game apart because they have already experienced this and it's not scary, and so they can just critique it from a removed stance, which is not the stance you want your players to have when it's a horror game. So
Yeah,
checkpoint your horror games, people.
Yeah,
The
seriously.
1916 was super short, so like it didn't matter. But Shudder was long enough where I'm like, they need to put some
To restart
checkpoints in
and
here.
play through another 15 minutes of stuff that's not going to be scary anymore. It's both one, like you said, it totally undercuts everything you're going for and the future scares, but it also is annoying. So it's just a poor game management system.
There was
wow,
one moment in Shudder, and we'll move on from Shudder soon here because we have a lot to cover.
especially we
But,
actually have some more stuff to talk about. We only have 20 minutes. So let's do. I mean, we don't have as much to say about Nightmare Ned. Actually, I don't think we even played that on stream, right?
We didn't, but I do want to talk about Nightmare Ned. So
Okay.
we played Nightmare Ned, which is a game from the 1997. It's based on a TV show that was made for children, and very strange because it's like it's a
No,
it's
it's
a,
the other way around. They made the show off the game.
oh, they made the show off the game. Wow, that's awful. Apparently, this game was popular enough that they thought it would make a good TV show,
Yep.
but
Got pulled off
it's
the air because of production costs and because too many parents wrote in that it was too scary for kids.
and being creepy AF.
AF,
Yeah,
yeah.
like it's just it's a weird category, horror, like children horror. Like I've always found that sort of stuff to be unsettling. Like Are You Afraid of the Dark on Nickelodeon?
I was thinking like
And-
the cartoons, like Invader Zim, Courage the Cowardly Dog,
Yep, all those.
Grim and Evil, way back in the day.
I mean, I guess Scooby Doo fits into that category, but it's not really that scary.
There's one episode of Scooby Doo that messed me. I usually was fine with it, and there was one episode. I'm trying to remember what it was, but it messed me the f up. Because for every one that they had where they like interacted with the Beatles, and it was like a flying bat creature, there was one where they had like a legit like specter that had killed some. It was oh man, gosh, I can't even remember what it was.
Well, Nightmare
Anyway, let me just
Ned.
think about
Yeah.
children horror, which is a bizarre subset of the genre. Basically, the question we were left with was, who in the F was that supposed to be made for? Because
Yeah.
we, as 25 and 20, I don't know how old are, Mark. 26, 27? I don't know. Mid-20-something-year-old men played it, and was, like, pretty... It was not something I want to continue to do.
No.
It was well done enough that it was deeply... I mean, it was upsetting. Much less if any child... Like, I guess a kid wouldn't get some of the, like, psychological undertones of, like, You know, the dragon reading that story to you, like the
Oh
head
my
on the wall, that
gosh.
was absolutely terrifying and probably be less scary to a kid because you don't really get it. But like, I mean, like the dentist chair that turns into a mouth of teeth and is a giant tongue and like bounces you up and down until the mouth closes over you and you get transported into like this dilapidated,
Tooth.
destroyed
Yeah, mouth.
mouth that you have to traverse and break teeth so that you can get to the next area. And there's these like, oh my god, like there's a dentist appears, actually teleports out of nowhere and stabs you with a syringe, and then teleports again. Like
It's,
it
yeah,
messed. It was
super
it was
strange for kids to be
and
playing
really
that.
really good animation, by the way. This is very smooth, beautiful
Cartoon,
art.
yeah.
Yeah.
Like, just to give you an idea of the sort of, like, crap they were pulling in this game, this wall on this disembodied dragon head on the wall, which in its own right wasn't actually that creepy, it was kind of cute.
Oh no.
But it told the story of this girl who had Greg, you weren't around for this one because you disconnected,
Oh, I missed
but
it. Yeah. Darn.
she had a pimple on her face, and it started to grow and she couldn't get rid of it. And like, okay, cool, like kids being afraid of like acne, fine, body horror, and then apparently it pops and spiders start coming out.
Oh my god. Ah,
And I was
jeez,
like, what?
dude. Oh my
Like,
god. I like
why
actually really
would
didn't need to
you?
hear that.
Why would you put that in a game for kids?
Oh my
Um,
god.
So anyway, that is the end of our explanation of Nightmare
Let's
Ned.
just
It's
leave it. One good thing, which is they kind of give the idea of like touring childhood fears. There's like 5 different worlds, and each one's a different fear, like the dentist or school or creepy old houses, or death. One's a graveyard, so maybe not. Anyway, don't play the game. It wasn't worth it.
no, it wasn't. It was a lot of work because we had to put it in a Windows XP VM, and it was just not worth it. So
Yeah. Oh my dude. Oh god.
sorry, Greg.
I really really wish I had known that.
Yeah,
What
well,
on to next? Lurking. I don't have to read the creepypasta anymore. God.
I mean, I tried to explain it in as brief terms as possible.
Oh, yeah. Thanks. That. Well, yeah. You did what you could. Okay, so the last one we did, my favorite at least, as well as in my opinion the only one that could have been developed into a full-fledged title that would be really freaking cool, I imagine,
Yeah,
was Lurking, which is a I think we talked. I would forget if we talked about this real quick. It was basically the world is revealed to you by echolocation. So when you make sounds, either by walking in the game or the mic, you actually will calibrate your mic to your breathing, to your talking, and to your screaming. It will, if the mic picks it up, then you'll make noise in the game as well. And when the sound waves go out, they bounce back, kind of like echolocation. You can only see things around you when noise is made, to kind of in a Daredevil-esque fashion or
right.
Dolphin-esque
Otherwise,
fashion.
everything
It's
is
real.
dark.
Yep, it's just dark. Everything's black, and when you illuminate something with sound, it's basically just all white, very minimalistic art. You're in a building of some type, and it's kind of hard to tell where you are. So it's a really cool idea. I don't think I've run across a game that was entirely based around sound, particularly the idea that it was co-opting your mic, and that as you were, if you were very scared, it didn't seem like we quite get our mic calibrated right. But the idea was that if you were even breathing too heavily because you were scared, then that would affect your character and make your sound more apparent, and you'd be making sound, and other people can find you via your sound, which is scary. So that's a really cool idea. And we ended up getting. I didn't play that one for too long. It was probably like 20, 30 minutes. But that actually ended up being, again, even with the very minimalistic art style, that one's definitely felt like a proof of concept one in terms of like the art wasn't too advanced. But there was a really, when we got caught by the bad guy, like everything appears in white, right? Like it's just all white lines, except for the bad guy is like red, like
Yeah,
deep
which
red,
was
and his
cool.
like, sound waves are red. And it's just a dude, it's just a human, I guess. But like when you see that red, like when you're creeping forward and making noise, and then you're like one of your waves hits red, it was like immediately like shit. And when we got caught by him, I mean, it was like it was horrible.
Yeah.
Kills
No,
you.
we did definitely made us want to stay away from it and like move really quickly because you have to actually go by him. You have to creep by him in order to advance
yes.
in the game.
Yeah.
So you do have to go confront this person, but it was unsettling. And And
I
it's
think that
surprising, given like how minimal the art style was. Like there was no detail. It didn't like it did a good job sort of suggesting creepiness, but it wasn't like a graphic villain like from Shudder.
oh god, no.
It was much more sort of
It's a
just an
stick figure,
outline.
like something you'd see in Flash almost, but in 3D.
But
I think they're. No, go ahead.
I think that I would love to see this mechanic applied to a game that had a different, maybe like a more fleshed out art style, because it was a really minimal art style. But you don't need that for this game. Like you totally could make
Right.
this game work with the quality of something like Shudder. Like there's there's
Hyper-perceptive.
there's no really like specific reason why they had it as a really minimal style. I think it was cool because it really showed off what the game was doing, which is using the sound to highlight things. But you can I think that would even work as a background mechanic. Like there's no reason why that has to be the thing in your game.
Right. And
Yeah.
that being like you can basically meld that idea, that mechanic, with other more well-worn horror tropes and pacing and setting and stuff like that, and I think you would have a very, very interesting. Basically, that system in and of itself, basically the ways you could do it. Whereas, like I said, there was the mic. There was when you moved, when you ran, you would make more noise than if you walked, crouched. But tying vision to sound was a really cool idea, and you could do so many creative things with that. Like think about what Portal did with like just the portal gun idea and all the different ways. Like designing a mechanic and then having ways to explore it is way better than kind of like one gimmick that like work like with the Shutter thing. Like there's only so many ways you can like utilize blinking light. The idea of like melding sound and echolocation is like there's tons of things you could do. You could have like dampening effects. You could have all these different kind of puzzles and enemies. Some ones that can hear you, some ones that can't hear you, can only hear themselves. They use like all kinds of different things. They're actually, even in the game, they had audio recordings, which was telling backstory, and it was a psychiatric hospital, so whatever. But as you were listening to them, that would be that was illuminating. They were a different color. They were yellow, and they would illuminate the area as they were making the noise. So to
Right.
get like
Like
more
you actually
lore,
had to listen as the player.
right, or like to solve a puzzle would be a way. Then you actually had to like get this information, which inherently was making you vulnerable. So there's so many cool ways that I think that could be leveraged and really built out, and I think you could make a full game out of that by slowly introducing different mechanics and different utilizations or tools or gadgets or whatever. The enemies. I could just see a lot of ways that could be expanded as opposed to that was the only game that we played where at the end I was like, yeah, that could be a full game. 1916 was done when it was done. Shudder, I was like, I don't really have any interest. And then Ned, I was like, what the actual hell?
It already was a full game, unfortunately.
Oh, yeah, I guess it wasn't looking at me. But Lurking I was really impressed by. And I think that one was actually definitely a grad project. So definitely. And the other thing I liked, I was talking about like hardware being very difficult to co-op. In large part, people, like voiceover is being integrated into multiplayer games, just like normally everyone has voice. So
Right.
mics is one piece of hardware that everyone can be counted to have on. So you can really integrate that. That would be an easy one to co-op, right? It wouldn't require a whole lot of extra hardware. You
Right.
assume that most people who are playing have mics nowadays.
Or at least
So
web
actually-
cameras that have audio of some sort. And
Exactly. Yeah, a laptop or. So yeah, I felt Lurking. All these were free, by the way. You can just Google them and look them up and download them and play them.
Yeah, the ones I would suggest playing are 1916 and Lurking, if you had to pick two,
Yeah.
and then Shudder if you like to have the fear of home invasion reinforced. So there's that.
Yep, that's it. So, woohoo, we did it!
We did it. We
That
made
is
it
our-
all the way through.
5 weeks of horror with two guys who've never done horror before.
Yeah, it's impressive. I guess I'll say in summary, so like future of horror, I think we're gonna see my prediction for horror.
Alright, yeah.
I don't think we're done with the psychiatric hospitals and the mind, mind games and everything yet. I just don't. I wish we were, but I think that's going to continue for another couple of years.
Yeah.
And
Probably.
psychology and psychological language are making its way more and more into everyday culture, for better or worse. So I think it's going to persist as a setting and as a theme. I do think that VR is actually going to become like an extremely important platform for horror, because right now VR, just the way that it's set up, developing for it is tough. It's resource intensive, and making short games are actually,
It's actually
they lend themselves
dark.
well to VR,
Yeah,
and
no,
short
it's a good
games lend
point.
themselves well to horror too, because for all the reasons we've mentioned over the last month, they just
Over
do.
a
Like
month.
horror games
Go
tend to
listen to the
not
other
be
four
super long.
podcasts. Right.
And so I think that
I do
actually
an
a lot
opening
of horror
report.
games will move onto VR just because it's a way to give people a much more visceral horror experience.
Right. And I think too, this is just a thing that's very much in the zeitgeist right now in terms of a lot of stuff, a lot of AAA releases in terms of Shadows of War and Battlefront 2 coming out, and um, uh, well, boy, Assassin's Creed Origins, and EA, releasing a statement that it views its games as services now as opposed to games. Um, that whole movement of finding ways to continually monetize games, with loot boxes and over. Horror games do not take to that well at all. The idea of unless you're just adding new chapters, kind of like in a Telltale-esque fashion, but that's really not the way most horror games work. So it'll be interesting to see if horror as a genre is actually going to be hurt by this kind of movement in towards a games as a service, kind of slow, continually giving small amounts of content. Certainly, the loot box microtransaction deal is a lot
Yeah.
harder to make work in a horror setting. So I wonder if you'll see a lot. I mean, see a lot less of that, or maybe people are going to rebel against that system, which I hope is already happening as consumers, and be looking for more kind of compact, polished single experiences. And horror also tends to be single player. So
Yeah.
in that case, I could see it going either way. Honestly, I do think this microtransaction loot box bubble is going to pop in the next like year or two. Would be my guess, honestly. But until then, I would imagine horror games might actually be on the downfall.
Well, I do think that one of the things I've grown to appreciate so much about horror over the last month is they really never do lose sight, and the good ones, they never lose sight of the fact that they are trying to deliver the player an experience. Like
Yeah,
like
yeah,
in a very pure form. Like they are trying to get
yeah.
you scared.
I've never
And
felt too like condescended to by a horror game yet.
yeah, that's
Maybe I
true
just didn't
too.
play any of the bad ones, but like I haven't felt like this level of like cynicism that I do with a lot of other like AAA games, where I'm like, okay, like I don't know, maybe it's just the loot box thing right now, but they're usually kind of pure, you know,
Yeah.
pure experiences.
Yeah, I'd say
Very
that's a
much
good
about
word for it.
the experience of the game, and it's pretty lovingly crafted to get those things from you.
And it's pretty niche. I mean, kind of in the same way that like everybody only goes to
Yeah,
haunted houses once a month. Like, I
right.
think it fills a similar niche.
Yeah,
And so I don't
yeah. I'd
expect that
imagine
horror
those
is going to
profits would just
be
be like
like
eighty
super.
percent.
Yeah, I don't imagine horror is going to like break into the mainstream and everyone's going to be playing horror games. That just doesn't make sense.
Right.
But I hope it's a niche that continues to survive because there is a purity to it, and I
Yeah.
appreciate that more now than I did at the beginning of the month.
Absolutely. I consider myself still a novice in a lot of ways, but I spent a lot of time thinking and writing about this over the past month, and I have a immense appreciation for horror as a genre. I think there's an incredible amount of art to it, and I think it's a really hard thing to do, and I think the people that do it really well are unbelievably skilled people. And I think that it's a incredibly cool medium with games to explore some of this stuff. So I've been converted in small ways. I don't think I'll ever play a game by myself, but it's something I like care about now, and actually am excited to like hear about games.
Well, I think speaking of horror, it's
Let's
time for us to do some of our own horror on the podcast. Um,
woohoo!
if you would
Dramatic
not like
reading.
to listen to our creepypasta, you can end the episode here. There's not going to be any more analysis or anything. It's just we're going to read and send you on your way. But let's jump into reading Candle Cove.
Woohoo! This is a classic creepypasta.
Okay. So I guess we'll
I'll
just
be Scott Shell.
you'll be Sky Shale, then I'll be Mike and Jaren.
Alrighty. Alright, so this is in the format of a forum post. So this is the first post. User SkyShale033. Subject: Candle Cove Local Kids Show. Does anyone remember this kids show? It was called Candle Cove, and I must have been 6 or 7. I never found any reference to it anywhere, so I think it was a local station around 1971 or 1972. I lived in Ironton at the time. I don't really remember which station, but I do remember it was on at a weird time, like 4 p.m.
Mike Painter responds, "It seems really familiar to me. I grew up outside of Ashland and was 9 years old in 1972. Candle Cove, was it about pirates? I remember a pirate marionette at the mouth of a cave talking to a little girl.
Yes, okay, I'm not crazy. I remember Pirate Percy. I was always kind of scared of him. He looked like he was built from parts of other dolls, like really low budget. His head was an old porcelain baby doll, looked like an antique that didn't belong on the body. I don't remember what the station was. I think it was WTSF, though.
Sorry to resurrect this old thread, but I know exactly what show you mean, Skyshale. I think Candle Cove ran for only a couple of months in 72 and 71, not 72. I was 12 and I watched it a few times with my brother. It was Channel 58, whatever that station was. My mom would let me switch to it after the news. Let me see what I remember. It took place in Candle Cove, and it was about a little girl who imagined herself to be friends with pirates. The pirate ship was called the Laughingstock, and Pirate Percy wasn't a very good pirate because he got scared too easily. And there was calliope music constantly playing. Don't remember the girl's name, Janice or Jade or something. Think it was Janice.
Thank you, Jaren. Memories flooded back when you mentioned the Laughingstock in Channel 58. I remember the bow of the ship was a wooden, smiling face with the lower jaw submerged. It looked like it was swallowing the sea and had that awful Ed Wynn laugh voice. I especially remember how jarring it was when they switched from the plastic to the wooden model or the foam puppet version of a head that talked.
Huh, yeah, I remember that too. Do you remember this part, Skyshale? You have to go inside.
Oh my god, I got a chill just reading that. Yeah, I remember. That's what the ship always told Percy when there was a spooky place he had to go in, like a cave or a dark room where the treasure was. And then the camera would push in on Laughingstock's face with each pause. You have to go inside. with his two eyes askew and that flopping foam jaw and the fishing line that opened and closed it. It looks so cheap and awful. You guys remember the villain? I think he had a face that was just a handlebar mustache about above really, really tall, narrow teeth. Oh, we got another one. I'll be him. Yeah, I honestly thought the villain was Pirate Percy. I was about 5 when this show came on. Absolute nightmare fuel.
That wasn't the villain, the puppet with the mustache. That was the villain's sidekick, Horace Horrible. He had a monocle too, but it was on top of the mustache. I used to think that meant he only had one eye. But yeah, the villain was another marionette, the Skin Taker. I can't believe that they let us watch that back then.
Jesus H. Christ, the Skin Taker. What kind of a kid show were we watching? I seriously could not look at the screen when the Skin Taker showed up. He just descended out of nowhere on his strings like a dirty skeleton wearing that brown top hat and cape, and his glass eyes that were too big for his skull. God almighty. Wasn't his top hat and cloak all sewn up like crazily? Was that supposed to be a children's skin?
Yeah, I think so. Remember, his mouth didn't open and close. His jaw just slid back and forth. I remember the little girl said, "Why does your mouth move like that?" And the Skin Taker didn't look at the girl but at the camera and said, "To grind your skin."
God, I'm so relieved that other people remember this terrible thing. I used to have this awful memory, a bad dream I had when the opening jingle ended, and the show faded in from black and all the characters were there, but the camera was just cutting to each of their faces, and they were screaming. They were just screaming, and the puppets and the marionettes were flailing spastically, and they were all just screaming and screaming. The girl was moaning and crying like she'd been through hours of this. I woke up like many times from that nightmare. I used to wet the bed when I had it. I don't think that was a dream. I remember that. I remember that was an episode. No, that's not possible. There wasn't a plot or anything. I mean, I was literally just standing in place, crying and screaming the whole show. I mean, maybe I'm manufacturing this memory because you said that, but I swear to God I remember seeing what you described. They just screamed.
Oh, God, yes. The little girl Janice. I remember seeing her shake, and the Skin Taker screaming through his gnashing teeth, his jaw careening so wildly I thought it would come off his wire hinges. I turned it off, and it was the last time I watched. I ran to tell my brother, and we didn't have the courage to turn it back on. I visited my mom at the nursing home. I asked her about when I was little in the early 70s, when I was 8 or 9, and if she remembered a kid's show, Candle Cove. She said she was surprised I could remember that, and I asked why. And she said, because I used to think it was so strange that you said, I'm going to go watch Candle Cove now, Mom, and then you would turn the TV to static and just watch dead air for 30 minutes. You had a big imagination with your little pirate show. And that's the end of Candle Cove. Whew. Creepy.
Yeah, those ones, that's definitely plays into, like, the psychological horror side of it, right? Like, none of that was, I mean, a lot of that's a little bit overtly scary, but thinking about the terror of these kids remembering 30 years ago. I also loved when you said the early 70s, when I was little in the early, I think you almost said 90s.
I did, yeah, habits, man.
Two in character.
You know, it happens. I just very method over here.
So that was one of the shortest. We were trying to find one that was like short enough to read on air, and there weren't too. Most creepypastas a little bit longer.
Yeah.
Browse at your own risk. There's some. I mean, this was a tame one.
Yes.
All things considered.
Yes.
And there was some really messed up stuff in here. So yeah, it's a bizarre form of collaborative storytelling in the internet age. Slenderman came from that, in case you were wondering. The Slenderman was an internet baby, and a young one. That was like 2010 when that started.
Yeah, it was pretty
crazy.
Its infancy. Well, join us next week. We will not be talking about horror. We're actually still coming up with what our theme will be, but rest assured that if you tune in next time,
it's going to be good.
It will not be scary. It won't be spooky. It will be about games, just like all of our podcasts.
We'll be doing... So. Yep. We'll be doing...
Thanksgiving-themed games.
Boob physics.
Again?
And,
you keep saying that, and eventually someone's going to hold us to that.
It's just my way of actually wanting to do an episode on boob physics.
Gosh.
No, that would be a really short episode.
I feel like there's probably not that much to say, but
yeah.
I could be wrong.
In any case, guys, thank you for listening. I hope you had a spooky October. Enjoy Halloween, be safe, and we will see you next week.
If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter @GamingMechanics or our Facebook by going to facebook.com/GamingMechanics. Thanks for listening.